From the University of California, Santa Cruz, this is Democracy Now!
I was not aware that there had been some holding back of the report. I think it's important to have all information in the marketplace.
The Environmental Protection Agency is facing a major new scandal after it worked with the White House to bury an alarming federal study detailing widespread chemical contamination of the nation's water supply. One Trump official warned release of the study would create a public relations nightmare. The study found the chemicals in Teflon and firefighting foam are a threat to human health at levels the EPA had previously called safe. We'll speak with Robert Bilott, the attorney the New York Times calls the worst nightmare of DuPont, the manufacturer of Teflon.
And it is now in the blood of not just 99% of Americans, but the entire globe, everybody on the planet. Polar bears, every animal on this, every animal species that's being tested. But it's coming from not only these plant emissions, it's coming from consumer product use as well.
Then we speak to Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg about the 50th anniversary of the Catonsville Nine, the role of civil disobedience, nuclear war, and the danger behind President Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal.
It is now in the blood of not just 99% of it.
I'm increasingly feeling that President Trump is not bluffing when he appears to be ready to do the crazy actions of either getting into a war with a nuclear weapons state, North Korea, or attacking Iran, which would be another catastrophe.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're on the road in Santa Cruz, California. I'm Amy Goodman. The Senate has confirmed Gina Haspel as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Haspel is a 33-year CIA veteran who is responsible for running a secret CIA black site in Thailand in 2002, where at least one prisoner was waterboarded and tortured in other ways during her tenure. Haspel also oversaw the destruction of videotapes showing torture at the black site. Haspel's confirmation came after 6 Democrats joined most Senate Republicans to approve her.
The ayes are 54, the nays are 45, and the nomination is confirmed.
The Democrats voting yes were Senators Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Manchin, Bill Nelson, Jeanne Shaheen, and Mark Warner. Republican Senators Jeff Flake and Rand Paul voted no, while John McCain was unable to cast a vote as he battles stage 4 brain cancer from his home in Arizona. Senator McCain is a former prisoner of war who was tortured in Vietnam. He said of Haspel, her role in overseeing the use of torture is disturbing, and her refusal to acknowledge torture's immorality is disqualifying. Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee who's privy to classified briefings, said of Haspel, quote, there is much more that the full Senate and the public should know about Haspel's background, and I'm convinced that if they did, her nomination would be rejected. President Trump said Thursday North Korean leader Kim Jong-un could suffer the same fate as Muammar Gaddafi if he refuses to give up his nuclear weapons. Trump's comment came after National Security Advisor John Bolton said Sunday the U.S. should use the so-called Libyan model for denuclearization.
The model, if you look at that model with Gaddafi, that was a total decimation. We went in there to beat him. Now, that model would take place if we don't make a deal, most likely. But if we make a deal, I think Kim Jong-un is going to be very, very happy.
In 2003, Libya negotiated sanctions relief from the United States in exchange for renouncing its nuclear program and welcoming international inspectors to verify the disarmament. 8 years later, Gaddafi was dragged through the streets and publicly killed by rebels after the U.S. and its allies intervened with a massive bombing campaign. In response to John Bolton's threat and to ongoing U.S.-South Korean war games, North Korea has threatened to pull out of the planned June 12th summit between President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The Trump administration will announce a new rule today that would end federal funding for women's health organizations that provide abortions or refer patients to other clinics for abortions. The rule is aimed at Planned Parenthood, the longtime target of anti-choice activists. This is former Planned Parenthood President Cecile Richards speaking earlier this month on Democracy Now!
It's a domestic gag order that would really parallel what's happening overseas. Women would no longer be able to get information about the legality of abortion, get referral, even mention the word if a healthcare provider is participating in the family planning program. Planned Parenthood provides more than 40% of the family planning through the National Family Planning Program. We would be banned, and women who come to us for health care would be banned. It is unbelievably extreme.
House lawmakers are set to vote today on a massive farm bill that contains major cuts to SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. According to the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, the bill would cut food assistance to more than 2 million people, while largely offsetting the savings by expanding state and federal bureaucracies. Today's vote comes as a new United Way study finds 40% of U.S. households cannot afford the basics of a middle-class lifestyle: rent, transportation, childcare, and a cell phone. The study finds more than 50 million U.S. households are now living in poverty or unable to meet the costs of ordinary expenses. Republican leaders in the Senate Intelligence Committee have broken ranks with President Trump and their House counterparts, saying they see no reason to dispute the conclusion that Russia interfered on behalf of Donald Trump in the 2016 U.S. election. The finding contradicts an earlier report by the Republican-controlled House Intelligence Committee, which says it found no evidence of collusion between Trump's campaign and the Russians. The news comes after President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said members of special counsel Robert Mueller's team have concluded they cannot indict a sitting president. The Trump administration said Thursday Chinese trade negotiators have offered to spend as much as $200 billion a year to purchase additional U.S. goods in a bid to prevent President Trump from imposing sanctions on Chinese products. But China's foreign ministry denies the claim, saying talks aimed at avoiding a trade war with the U.S. are still ongoing. Trump said Thursday he doubts the trade negotiations with China will succeed. Egypt's authoritarian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, has ordered the Rafah border crossing with the Gaza Strip opened until the end of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan on June 14th. It would be the longest such opening in years and comes after Israel shot and killed 111 Palestinians and injured thousands more at the Great March of Return nonviolent protests that began on March 30th. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, health officials are warning an outbreak of Ebola could potentially explode after the first confirmed case of the deadly virus was found in Bandaka, a city of more than 1 million people. This is Peter Salama of the World Health Organization.
Urban Ebola is a very different phenomenon to rural Ebola, because we know that people in urban areas can have far more contacts. So that means that urban Ebola can result in an exponential increase in cases in a way that rural Ebola struggles to do.
So far, at least 45 people have been infected by the virus, with the death toll now at 25. An Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014 claimed more than 11,000 lives. Colombia's government has ordered tens of thousands of people to evacuate areas along the Cauca River as heavy rains threaten to breach a hydroelectric dam under construction. At least 600 people have been left homeless after workers cleared a blockage at the megadam in northwestern Colombia, causing a surge in river levels downstream that flooded homes and destroyed schools, bridges, and a health center. Back in the United States, NASA's newly confirmed administrator, Jim Bridenstine, affirmed the science of climate change Thursday in a break from the Republican Party and from his own previous statements denying global warming. Speaking to NASA employees at a town hall meeting at the agency's headquarters in Washington, D.C., the former Oklahoma Republican congressmember said his position on climate change has evolved. In 2013, Bridenstine demanded President Obama apologize for funding climate research and falsely said from the House floor that global temperatures stopped rising early this century.
I don't deny the consensus that the climate is changing. In fact, I fully believe and know that the climate is changing. I also know that we, human beings, are contributing to it in a major way.
Bridenstine's new comments come a day after Alabama Republican Congressmember Mo Brooks suggested during a House Science Committee hearing that coastal erosion and not rising greenhouse gas is to blame for rising sea levels. Congressmember Brooks made the comments as he questioned Philip Duffy, president of the Woods Hole Research Center.
What about
I'm pretty sure
the
that
White
that's
Cliffs of Dover, California, where you have the waves crashing against the shorelines, and time again you're having the cliffs crash into the sea. All of that displaces water, which forces it to rise, does it not?
I'm pretty sure that on human timescales, those are minuscule effects.
President Trump has dismissed climate change as a Chinese hoax and has ordered the U.S. to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. A New York court ruled Thursday a defamation lawsuit brought by a former contestant on Donald Trump's reality TV show The Apprentice can proceed. Summer Zervos has accused Trump of repeatedly sexually assaulting her during a meeting in 2007, saying he kissed her on her lips, pressed his body against hers, groped her breasts, all without her consent. She's one of at least 16 women who've publicly accused Trump of sexual misconduct. After Trump called Zervos and other women accusers liars during the 2016 campaign, Zervos sued Trump for defamation, demanding an apology and compensation. Trump's lawyers have argued the president is immune from all civil lawsuits filed in state court until he leaves office. Fox News has named longtime executive Suzanne Scott as CEO. Scott is the first chief executive at the right-wing TV network since Roger Ailes was forced to resign in 2016 amidst multiple accusations of sexual harassment. Scott has been cited in lawsuits by at least 2 former women employees at Fox who say she covered up their complaints of harassment. She also reportedly worked to maintain Roger Ailes' demand that women at the network wear skimpy outfits, with one former Fox News contributor saying, quote, "You've got to wear your skirts short and your heels high." In Hawaii, officials are struggling to distribute thousands of gas masks to residents of the state's Big Island after the Kilauea volcano erupted violently Thursday, spewing ash high into the atmosphere and throwing huge rocks hundreds of meters from the volcano's crater. Although Thursday's explosion was dramatic and led to a surge in toxic sulfur dioxide gas and choking ash, geologists are warning that even more powerful eruptions might soon take place. And a New York City lawyer caught on camera making racist remarks to Spanish-speaking patrons at a Manhattan restaurant this week has lost his office space and is now at risk of being disbarred. New York Congress member Adriano Espaillat said Thursday he's filed a grievance against Aaron Schlossberg, a lawyer in Midtown Manhattan who threatened to call immigration enforcement after overhearing customers and staff speaking Spanish. The racist tirade went viral this week.
And my guess is they're not documented. So my next call is to ICE to have each one of them get out of my country.
Schlossberg hid from reporters outside his Manhattan home Thursday wearing a black ski cap and covering his face with an open umbrella. When questioned by a local NBC affiliate, he turned and sprinted down a Manhattan street away from cameras. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Scott Pruitt faced lawmakers on Capitol Hill for a third time in less than a month as senators grilled him about a slew of scandals over his spending habits, ties to industry lobbyists, and his deregulation of environmental protections. Pruitt is currently facing about a dozen investigations, including into his $3 million security detail. His expensive first-class travel, his below-market value condo, which he rented from the wife of an energy lobbyist, and his other spending and ethics violations. Wednesday's hearing came only 2 days after Politico reported the Environmental Protection Agency and the White House has suppressed publication of a federal health study on a national water contamination crisis. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services study found the chemicals PFOA and PFOS, which are used in Teflon and firefighting foam, are unsafe for human health at levels the EPA had previously called safe. In other words, these chemicals are more dangerous than previously thought. But internal emails released after a Freedom of Information Act request show a Trump administration aide warning the EPA's top financial officer, quote, "The public, media, and congressional reaction to these numbers is going to be huge. The impact to EPA and DOD is going to be extremely painful. We, DOD and EPA, cannot seem to get ATSDR, that's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, to realize the potential public relations nightmare this is going to be," unquote. The study remains unpublished. The Pentagon's used foams containing these chemicals in exercises at military bases nationwide. In a March report to Congress, the Pentagon listed 126 military installations where the nearby water shows potentially harmful levels of these chemicals, which have been linked to cancers and developmental delays for fetuses and babies. During Wednesday's hearing, Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia asked Pruitt if he ultimately planned to publish the report.
I was not aware that there had been some holding back of the report. I think it's important to have all information in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
We evaluate this. What's most important to me is not just studies. I mean, as you know, I think the health advisory is 70 parts per trillion,
right?
Which is a very strong standard. But we need to make sure that if there's an MCL, maximum contaminant limit, or a 107 approach, that it's based on a record. And that's what we would proceed with post the summit next week. So, but as far as information, we need more information, not less.
The EPA and White House's effort to suppress the study is only the latest twist in a decades-long fight over Teflon's highly toxic chemical PFOA, also known as C8. For decades, the chemical giant DuPont hid information about the toxicity of this chemical, even as the company discharged it into the waterways around its manufacturing plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia. PFOA, or C8, has now been linked to 6 diseases, including testicular and kidney cancers. The chemical has been used so widely, it's now in the bloodstream of 99% of Americans, even newborn babies. And the chemical is bioresistant, meaning it doesn't break down. Well, for more, we're joined by Rob Bilott, the leading environmental lawyer who represented 70,000 Americans in lawsuits against the chemical giant DuPont. He successfully won compensation for his clients whose drinking water had been contaminated by toxic chemicals used to make Teflon. Rob Bilott is a recipient of the 2017 Right Livelihood Award. He was also the subject of a 2016 New York Times Magazine article headlined "The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare." Rob Bilott is here at the University of California, Santa Cruz for a gathering of the North American Right Livelihood laureates. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Rob.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So it's great to have you with us. Talk about this latest Politico report.
Well, it's very disturbing. For many years, I have been trying to make sure that the public, the millions of people across this country and now globally that have these chemicals in their blood, in their drinking water, that these people have access to the most accurate and complete information about the health risks that are posed from being exposed to these chemicals. We're talking about man-made synthetic chemicals that don't exist in nature, that are now in the blood of millions of people across the country.
Of almost everyone.
About everyone, and in wildlife and living things all over the planet. And for many years, I've been trying to encourage the federal government, the U.S. EPA, the ATSDR, to release as much information about the health risks from these chemicals as possible. And what we've now learned is that one of the federal agencies that has primary responsibility for looking at human health effects from chemical exposure, ATSDR, has developed a draft.
ATSDR stands for, again?
The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It's a part of the federal government created back in the 1980s, whose specific purpose is to look at potential human health effects from exposure to hazardous materials. And what we understand is that the agency has come up with a draft report that apparently has taken a new look at the health risks from not only the Teflon-related chemical PFOA and the firefighting foam-related chemical PFOS, but several additional chemicals as well that are also now getting into people's blood and in drinking water across the country. And they're looking at that information and are suggesting that the levels of exposure that might cause harm are actually a lot lower than what U.S. EPA has now been telling the people across the country.
I want to turn to a comment from former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who tweeted Wednesday, "I'm a simple guy, so I have a simple remedy when people like Pruitt ignore or hide pollution. If you don't have a problem with Americans drinking contaminated drinking water, drink it yourself until you tap out or resign."
Well, you know, what we're dealing with here is a nationwide, if not global, public health threat. Whether it's a public relations nightmare, we have people that are dealing with a public health nightmare. So it's critically important to get the most accurate, complete health information out there as quickly as we can.
So, according to Politico, the Trump administration, a White House official, said this report, if it gets out, will be a public relations nightmare. Now, explain, it looks at the areas around military bases, industrial areas, and what do you suspect it finds?
Well, I believe the agency has looked at various studies that try to assess at what levels in humans and in animals can these chemicals cause harm. And like many states across the country, including the state of New Jersey, for example, which is suggesting that the levels that are allowable in drinking water ought to be a lot lower than what US EPA is currently saying. US EPA, for example, is saying 70 parts per trillion is acceptable in drinking water. Folks that are looking at a lot of the more current data, for example, the state of New Jersey, are suggesting levels as low as 14 or even lower. And I believe people are thinking that this particular report that ATSDR has prepared is also going to suggest that those numbers ought to be a lot lower than they are now.
What's firefighting foam?
Firefighting foam has historically contained a combination of these chemicals, PFOA, PFOS, and is now possibly including some of these newer replacement chemicals that were previously thought to hopefully be safe, but may present some of the same troubling characteristics as the older materials. And what's happening now is the chemicals used in those foams are being found in drinking water around military bases, airports across the country and worldwide, in Australia, New Zealand, because these chemicals have been released through the foam that was released out into the environment and are now contaminating water all over the planet.
In March, Washington State Governor Jay Inslee signed the nation's first law banning firefighting foam and food packaging that contains PFAS, which is the class of chemicals that includes PFOA and PFOS.
Correct.
That's
Correct.
Washington State.
That's Washington State.
So now it's going to the states that are taking the lead as opposed to the EPA.
Yeah. As we sit here today in the year 2018, there is still not a federally enforceable standard for any of these chemicals in drinking water. There's an informal guideline from US EPA. And because the chemical and related chemicals are showing up in drinking water all over the country, all over the world, there are states that are taking matters into their own hand and moving forward a lot quicker and saying, we're going to set standards, like New Jersey.
I want to turn to Lori Cervera, a resident of Warminster, Pennsylvania, which is home to the former Naval Air Warfare Center and only a few miles from the Willow Grove military base. She's speaking in a video produced by The Intercept.
Looking into what would cause kidney cancer because it didn't run in my family. I don't have any history of it. Don't have any history of multiple sclerosis in my family. So I looked into it and found an article about the chemical, the PFOA and PFOS that was in fire retardant foam that's used at air bases. We were less than a half a mile away from the air base.
And this is another resident of Warminster, Joanne Stanton.
Right after I had had my third son, we found out that my oldest child, Patrick, who was 6 years old at the time, just getting ready to enter first grade. He was having migraines for the last few years, but they were getting more intense. He was having nauseousness, vomiting in the morning, and then having a problem with his balance. And we took him to the doctors, and the MRI revealed a brain tumor. The doctors came in our room, and they started pummeling us with questions. Where do you live? Where did you grow up? Do you ever work with pesticides? Do you live near a farm? Do you live under high-tension wires? And these are questions that I never would have even thought about.
Rob Blunt, just responding to what they are saying.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, these are chemicals that are presenting all kinds of different potential health threats. And one of the issues that we're particularly concerned about now is realizing that our nation's firefighters and emergency responders who have been using these firefighting foams or whose equipment and gear that they wear may have been coated with materials that included some of these chemicals in the past. Those firefighters and emergency responders have very high levels of these chemicals now in their blood. And we now need to know, what is that doing to our firefighters?
We're speaking to Attorney Rob Bilott, who's represented 70,000 citizens in lawsuits against DuPont. They're concerned about their drinking water being contaminated by toxic chemicals used to make Teflon and also firefighting foam. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
Starting all over again, it's gonna be rough for us, but we're gonna make it. Starting all over as friends, it's gonna be tough on us, but we gotta face it. We lost what we had, that what hurt us so bad, set us back 1,000 years.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Our guest is the Livelihood Laureate, Rob Bilott. We spoke to him first in January at the Sundance Film Festival because there was a film, The Devil We Know, that had just come out that features him and some of his clients taking on the issue of Teflon. Chemicals in Teflon have contaminated 99% of the population of the United States. As we continue to look at the issue of water contamination, next week there's going to be an EPA summit, but not everyone's invited. Can you talk about that, Rob?
I think highlighting the importance of the issue and how widespread the problem is across the entire country, with almost every state having a community that has water contamination now affected by these chemicals. The U.S. EPA is having a pretty unprecedented event. They are holding a national summit next week to address this entire class of chemicals, not just PFOA and PFOS, but all the related chemicals as well that are showing up in drinking water and in human blood. Representatives from all 50 states have been invited to come into this conference, and there was originally some concern about whether citizens and impacted communities would be allowed to attend as well. There's now, my understanding, there's going to be a live feed that people can listen in and hopefully participate in this.
How can they participate if they're not allowed in the room?
That's a good question. I asked if I could participate, and so far I've not been allowed to go and attend this meeting. I've been told I can call in and listen in on a live feed. But, you know, it's...
But the chemical industry will be there?
My understanding, looking at the agenda that's now been posted, is a representative of the American Chemistry Council, or ACC, will actually not only be there, but be participating in the conference.
And what will be decided at the summit?
Don't know what will actually be the result of this summit, other than bringing all these state and federal agency representatives together to try to come up with a plan of how do we address this nationwide contamination problem.
I want to turn to a video, an NBC News report on how new research shows cancer has become the #1 killer of firefighters in the United States, including oral, digestive, respiratory, as well as urinary cancers.
In Boston, where it's illegal for firefighters to smoke, 3 new cancer cases are reported each month, twice the rate of city residents.
Certainly this is an epidemic in the fire service. This is something that's going to consume us.
Researchers say today's fires involving synthetics, plastics, and chemicals can cover firefighters in a toxic soot.
I have kidney cancer.
I have brain cancer.
There's no cure for it.
On the memorial wall at fire headquarters, the faces of cancer. 190 firefighters who've died of job-related cancer just since 1990, far more than the number who have died actually fighting fires.
Who is responsible for this, Rob Bilott? That was an NBC News report.
That's exactly what we'd like to find out. Right now, we know that the firefighting community has very high levels of these chemicals in their blood. Blood testing that's been done over the years has indicated this is a particularly highly exposed community. They're not only exposed to these chemicals in the firefighting foam that they use and often are coated in, but there's concern that a lot of the equipment or gear that they've worn over the years, that some of the stain proofing or waterproofing materials may have been manufactured using some of these chemicals, and trace amounts of those chemicals may have also ended up on the coatings as well. And can any of those chemicals then get into the human body because of that? And this is something that has never adequately been researched to date. And we have been actually asking the federal agencies, including I sent a letter to the ATSDR, the same agency we talked about earlier, in last September, asking and pleading for the agency to do a national study of firefighters that have been exposed to these chemicals. So not only should we be studying people who were exposed to these chemicals in drinking water, but the firefighting community who has this special additional exposure, we need to be studying this to find out, are these very high cancer rates that we just heard about related to these chemicals in the equipment and the foams that they've been using?
Finally, overall, how can people protect themselves? And which are the corporations that make this?
Yeah. Most of these chemicals, this entire family of chemicals, which now includes about 3,000 chemicals that are part of what we call the per- and polyfluoroalkylated. The best known, they're the chemicals that have 8 carbons or C8s. There are now a bunch of related chemicals that have been made that are C4, C6s that were hoped to be safer that are now showing up with some of the same toxicity concerns. A lot of those chemicals, that chemistry was originally invented by the 3M company. DuPont manufactured PFOA for many years. So then you have a variety of companies that use those materials and to make other products.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us. We'll continue to follow these stories and cases. Rob Bilott, our guest, represented 70,000 citizens in lawsuits against DuPont, successfully won compensation for his clients whose drinking water had been contaminated by toxic chemicals used to make Teflon. Bilott is a leading environmental lawyer, recipient of the 2017 Right Livelihood Award, was the subject of a 2016 New York Times Magazine article headlined "The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare." When we come back, we'll speak with one of the most famous whistleblowers in the world. Yes, Daniel Ellsberg. Stay with us.
Gather around me, folks, I'll tell you all a story of a man who let the people know the score. Not for fame, not for riches, not for glory. He's the man who leaked the truth about the war. Well, this man worked for a giant corporation whose main job is keeping secrets in a hush. He was aware of all the problems in the nation, sick and tired of all this beating round the bush. His position called for access to
The Ballad of Daniel Ellsberg by Ruly Garcia here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from the University of California, Santa Cruz, the basement of the McHenry Library. We are here at University of California for a gathering of the Right Livelihood laureates in North America. We spend the rest of the hour with one of those laureates, Daniel Ellsberg, perhaps the nation's most famous whistleblower. In 1971, he was a high-level defense analyst when he leaked a top-secret report on U.S. involvement in Vietnam to the New York Times and other publications that came to be known as the Pentagon Papers. He played a key role in ending the Vietnam War. Ellsberg also was a consultant to the Department of Defense in the White House, where he drafted plans for nuclear war. He writes about this in his new book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Dan Ellsberg reveals for the first time he also made copies of top-secret documents from his nuclear studies, an entire second set of papers in addition to the Pentagon Papers, for which he's known. In 2006, he won the Right Livelihood Award, often referred to as the Alternative Nobel. We spoke on Thursday, on the 50th anniversary of one of the most famous acts of civil disobedience in the U.S. On May 17, 1968, a group of Catholic priests and lay people broke into a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland. In 1968, stole 378 draft cards and burned them in the parking lot as a protest against the Vietnam War. They burned them with homemade napalm. They became known as the Catonsville Nine.
We regret very much, I think all of us, the inconvenience and even the suffering that we brought to these clerks here. We sincerely hope we didn't injure anyone. Our Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
We have chosen to be powerless criminals.
Forgive us our
in a time of criminal power. We have chosen to be branded as peace criminals by war criminals.
Participants included Fathers Daniel and Philip Berrigan. Father Berrigan, Dan Berrigan, made national headlines when he went underground for 4 months after his trial. When I spoke to Dan Ellsberg Thursday, I began by asking him about the Catonsville Nine.
I remember above all when Dan Berrigan was finally captured after a number of months eluding the FBI. As my wife and I did for just 13 days. I don't think we would have thought of doing that instead of surrendering to the FBI when the order came out for us without Dan's example, that this was a way to continue an action, to continue resistance to a war, that you didn't have to submit meekly. And when he was finally arrested, the picture I always remember is giving the peace sign in handcuffs, something I always remembered when later I was in handcuffs, and that inspired me. But the smile on his face. In fact, I was just looking at the cover of a terrific book on him by our friend Jim Forrest, At Play in the Lion's Den, with Daniel, and there is that picture of him smiling, and I remember it so clearly.
That's right. He was captured on Block Island, and that picture is 2 FBI agents on either side. He's got the peace sign up, and I think a journalist then said to him, "What are your plans, Dan Berrigan?" And he said, "Resistance."
Yes, the life of resistance, he talked it. We were at Danbury Prison when his brother was on trial, Phil, and Liz, for supposedly attempting to kidnap Kissinger. And he was introduced in front of me as Father Daniel Ellsberg. And he said, "No, Daniel Ellsberg, that bad Jesuit, is sitting behind me." But when they were burning the draft files, I remember it was Dan's statement, "We apologize, good friends, for our fracture of good order here and for burning paper instead of babies." A macabre statement. And yet, when LBJ objected very much to the chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you burn today or kill today?" It was actually a very fair question, which never got answered, essentially. We never counted the number of people we were killing or making refugees. That was something the Pentagon didn't need to know. And so it is today. I think in Iraq, America has never faced up to the number of people who have died because of our invasion, our aggression against Iraq. And Afghanistan, over the last 30 years, since we first inspired a CIA and sponsored jihad against the Soviets there and led to the invasion by the Soviets, what we've done to the Middle East has been hell.
You weren't always a peace activist. You worked for the Pentagon and the Rand Corporation. You were one of the few who had the secret history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam locked away in your safe. What changed you? What made you decide to open your safe and copy those thousands of pages and release them to the press?
I'd read this study, 23 years of lies and breaking treaties, escalations, deceit of the American people from 1945 to 1968. And second, I knew that it was going on under a fifth president in a row, Richard Nixon. I knew from insiders, and I'd worked for Nixon at the very beginning of his administration as a consultant on Vietnam, and I knew that he didn't intend to get out, but was trying to win, essentially, by threatening nuclear war and to prolong General Thieu, our puppet in Saigon, in power through his second term. So the war, I was sure, was going to go on and was going to get larger. But the key thing, the immediate thing, was that I met young Americans who were on their way to prison, like Bob Eaton and Randall Keeler, who had decided that the strongest statement they could make about the war was not by going to Sweden or being a conscientious objector, which they could have done, or going to Vietnam, but to go to prison. Now, my country had come to this, I realized. But I also realized, looking at them, that if they could do it, I could do it, and that meant I should do it. The question in my mind was that they put there was, how can I help shorten the war now that I'm ready to go to prison?
So you released the Pentagon Papers, or you got them to the New York Times and then to the Washington Post. There's a new film out called The Post about the Washington Post role. Is it accurate in releasing the papers?
Well, it's a Hollywood film. It's not a documentary. But I enjoy seeing myself played by a terrific actor who looks much the way I did at the time, only better.
The New York Times, has it ever acknowledged that you were the source of the Pentagon Papers?
No, as a matter of fact, they used to say for about 20 years, Daniel Ellsberg, if I came into the news at all, who says that he gave the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, and I called them several times and said, can you change that frame? And they say, no, we don't reveal our sources. I said, well, I was on trial for this, and I've acknowledged it very much myself, nor has the Washington Post ever revealed me as the source of their studies, except in this movie, which is not by the Washington Post.
Why is it important to you that they should just directly acknowledge that you were the source of the Pentagon Papers?
At the time, it was simply that people would ask me, what do they mean by that, the man who says he gave it to them? And I didn't appreciate that question. No, it wasn't important in itself. And as a matter of fact, I think that Ed Snowden did exactly the right thing by being out of the country where he could communicate with reporters, just as Dan Berrigan did the right thing by leaving, evading the FBI for months and being able to communicate with the public in a way that he couldn't have done in prison. And Snowden, like Chelsea Manning, would have been incommunicado. She was in solitary confinement for 10.5 months of her 7 years in prison. And Snowden could not be communicating with us about the dangers of surveillance as he has been doing for years now if he were in this country. He's in effect in permanent exile.
Dan Ellsberg, you were vilified by the right for years, but when Ed Snowden went into exile in Moscow because he couldn't leave Russia, the U.S. had pulled his passport, the very right that vilified you said, well, Ed Snowden, some said he should be killed, some said he should be executed, he should be jailed, but they said he's no Dan Ellsberg.
Well, that was an attempt, as you say, to vilify Snowden. Actually, I identify more with Ed Snowden and Chelsea Manning than with any other two individuals in the world. They went through what I did in the way of a transition in their consciousness, and they acted in ways that would permanently constrain their career. In my case, Nixon didn't achieve what he had in mind, which was 115 years in prison, or at another point to incapacitate me totally. But that was by kind of a miraculous set of events that cost Nixon his job and made the war endable. So that was kind of a miracle, and we need more miracles like that. We need more Ed Snowdens and Chelsea Manning, I would
Explain that. How is it that you didn't end up in jail for 115 years and Nixon remained the president?
The revelation of the history in the Pentagon Papers influenced people to be against the war, but they were already against the war, and that didn't affect Nixon. He went on with the war. What Nixon responded to was his fear, rather well-founded fear, that I might have documents on his current nuclear threats and his plan to escalate, as he did in the mining of Haiphong Harbor and his renewal of bombing, heavy bombing. And he thought that I could prove that with documents in a way that the public would lead to public opposition to his policy. So he had to shut me up. And to do that in this country, he had to take what were then crimes, warrantless wiretapping of associates on whom I was heard, hiring CIA people for the White House to burglarize my former psychoanalyst office, hoping to get information he could blackmail me with into silence, and later bringing some of those same CIA assets who were later caught in the Watergate to Washington to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally on the steps of the Capitol.
What do you mean?
Well, that's what do I mean? That's what I asked their prosecutor, William Merrill. I said, what does that mean? Kill me? He said the words were to incapacitate you totally. Then he said, but you have to understand these guys who were all CIA assets from the Bay of Pigs earlier, never use the word kill. They say neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, incapacitate. They don't talk about killing. He thought the intent was to kill me. I actually think the intent was to shut me up at the moment he was about to mine Haiphong, which I was predicting.
And how did your trial end?
Well, the trial ended when by John Dean, who exposed the burglary of my doctor's office earlier. Later, people exposed the attempt to incapacitate me, and then finally the warrantless wiretapping. So the judge, in the end, when he couldn't find the files for the wiretapping because they'd been kept out of the FBI files, they were in the White House because they were criminal, and they didn't want J. Edgar Hoover to blackmail Nixon with the evidence of this White House ordered crime. So without even those files, the judge said this offends a sense of justice, a pattern of governmental misconduct. But what was more important was that these same charges then came to confront Nixon. The war would not have ended with Nixon in office. And by the way, in 1973, early 73, when my final stage of my trial started, the possibility of Nixon not finishing his second term, which he just won in a landslide, was zero. It was impossible. It was like the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989, or Nelson Mandela, let's say, becoming president without a violent revolution. These were impossible events, which did occur. And I'm saying that the ending of the war, as early as 75, depended on Nixon being out of office, which he was in 74. And that was simply unforeseeable, and it relied on a lot of people doing unusual things. Alexander Butterfield revealing the White House taping, which revealed that John Dean had been telling the truth when he accused the president of a cover-up and of criminal acts. Then later, the Attorney General, and then resigning, Elliot Richardson, rather than fire a special prosecutor. We're back at that today, that issue. And then when a second person, Ruckelshaus, same man, by the way, who had revealed the FBI wiretapping of me, was now the acting Attorney General, and he resigned rather than fire the special prosecutor. That was the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. So that got the public aroused and called for another special prosecutor to be named independent of the White House at this point. We may live through that again very shortly.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about, Dan Ellsberg. If you see parallels between Richard Nixon and Donald Trump.
Well, Trump is almost blatantly talking about Nixon's madman theory, the idea that Trump, as the president, as Nixon pretended to be at least, is unbalanced, capable of intemperate actions, able of going to war using nuclear weapons. The problem, of course, for the world is that it's all too easy to believe that Trump is mad in this case. Jong-un gives a similar impression. I'm less convinced that Kim is not bluffing on this point. But I'm increasingly feeling that President Trump, is not bluffing when he appears to be ready to do the crazy actions of either getting into a war with a nuclear weapon state, North Korea, or attacking Iran, which would be another catastrophe. Not nuclear until we use them against Iran's underground sites, as Vice President Cheney wanted to do in 2006. And was exposed there, I think, by a leak by my friend Seymour Hersh, who showed that the Joint Chiefs were against that. I think that was a major factor in that not happening then. We're on the verge now of, I think, a two-sided nuclear war, a limited one with North Korea. They don't have the capability, they don't have enough weapons to cause nuclear winter, and they don't have enough cities to burn for us to cause nuclear winter, but it will be more violence in a day, in a week, in a month than the world has ever seen in that period of time.
Do you think a summit is possible?
Well, of course, what we've been hearing is that a summit is possible, and that, by the way, was not foreseen 2 months ago. At the same time, as we talk, as you know, that's being put into question very severely. It always looked improbable or implausible rather than impossible, which it would have looked earlier. Now it does look unlikely. If it fails, there is, by the way, I think, an agreement that could come out of that summit that would be for the good of all. A double freeze, as the Chinese and Russians put it, on their testing of H-bombs and H-warheads and missiles, ICBMs, and on our part, ceasing to rehearse assassination of Kim Jong-un, so-called decapitation, or rehearsing invasions of North Vietnam, which we do at least annually, and signing at last a peace treaty after, what is it, almost more than 60 years. So, and with trade, normalizing relations with North Korea. I think that's possible, at least more than possible, but it doesn't seem where we're headed. In terms of Trump seems to be pressing, with Bolton's urging, at a totally infeasible notion of beginning, or in the very early stages of their giving up their deterrent entirely, all their nuclear weapons they constructed. I think that Kim Jong-un thinks that would be crazy for him, and that's not the kind of crazy he is. The kind of crazy that Trump is, I'm afraid, is that he could start that war.
What is your assessment of the National Security Advisor John Bolton, who said in Sunday talk show, as the summit was, about to get underway in a few weeks, that he was looking at the Libya option?
Well, that's such a macabre, black humor kind of joke. Of course, a major promoter of the the expensive and difficult nuclear program in North Korea is precisely that example that Bolton is. He doesn't want to end with a bayonet in his back any more than Gaddafi wanted that. And his notion of his determination to have some nuclear weapons is precisely to avoid that. But Bolton, of course, has made no secret for years that he thought North Korea should be attacked. And that's extended into the period when North Korea is a nuclear state. We haven't made threats against the nuclear state since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I participated in 1962.
How were you involved?
Oh, well, I was working on 2 working groups under the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, the so-called XCOM, and I was sleeping in the Pentagon several nights toward the end of that crisis, and of course I describe it in some detail in my book. But what I didn't realize at the time was how very close we came to ending human civilization, or most human life at that time. With what we already had was a doomsday machine, a system for destroying every city in Russia and China, with the effect of causing smoke in the stratosphere, lofted into the stratosphere, that would blot out 70% of the sunlight reaching the Earth and kill all the harvests. In effect, it would have led to worldwide starvation, including in this country. Not just an ordinary famine, the end of food. And that has been really the consequence we can expect since 1983, when it was discovered that smoke was the most widespread lethal effect of such a large nuclear attack. So that our strategic command is, in effect, a starvation command. We've found a way to bring about the death by famine of virtually all humans.
So 2 things are happening at once. The possibility of the U.S.-North Korea summit, or the torpedoing of it, and the U.S., President Trump, pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes, the pulling out of the Iran deal seems to have no imaginable benefit to anybody except those madmen who want to see Iran destroyed in a military attack, a war that seems to be Netanyahu and the Sunni rivals of Iran, Saudi Arabia and others, who want to see the U.S. destroy, with Israeli help, Iran's military apparatus that could well lead to the use of U.S. nuclear weapons against underground command bunkers and sites in Iran. But the key effect of that, as of a war in Korea, is not directly nuclear winter, as it would be in a war against Russia. Actually, this would be, in either case, a war in which Russia and China would be on the other side. I think the main effect in the long run would be that it would kill, for generations perhaps, the chance of the kind of cooperation with Russia and China that's essential both to deal with climate change and with eliminating the doomsday machines on both sides. It would make them permanent in effect. And although they haven't been triggered by their hair trigger posture over the last 70 years yet, I think that's by a kind of miracle, the kind of miraculous secular miracle that I've been talking about earlier, which can be good or not so good. I think we've been saved by very, very good luck, and that's not so likely to continue without a major change in our policies. So what I'm really saying is that it's urgent. It's urgent to dismantle this doomsday machine and to deal with the climate problem in the way that it was urgent to raise the levees and strengthen the levees in New Orleans before Katrina, as was recommended and requested, demanded every year for more than a decade before Katrina struck. Likewise, it was urgent to stop building in flood zones in Houston before Harvey struck. But in this case, we're talking about the world being obliterated, the world of humanity and of civilization.
What message do you have for government insiders who are considering becoming whistleblowers?
My message to them is, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are actually falling or thousands more have died before you do what I wish I'd done years earlier in '64 or even '61 on the nuclear issue, and that is reveal the truth that you know, the dangerous truths that are being withheld by the government, at whatever cost to yourself, whatever risk that may take. Consider doing that, because a war's worth of lives may be at stake. Or in the case of the two existential crises I'm talking about, the future of humanity is at stake. So many graduating classes, I think, have been told year after year for half a century that they face a crossroads, or that much depends on what they do. That's no exaggeration right now. It's this generation, not the next one, that the people living right now that have to change these problems fast. And I think truth-telling is crucial to mobilize that.
What is the information that you think most needs to be revealed right now?
Well, I'm certain that there are studies in the Pentagon and CIA and the NSC right now that reveal two things that would be disastrous, catastrophic, to go to war against North Korea, even though the immediate casualties would be measured in millions rather than billions, which is the nuclear winter problem. And likewise, it would be catastrophic to be at war with Iran, a nation 4 times the size and population of Iraq. And as I say, we've never faced up to the human cost of that war, Iraq. So I'm sure there are studies, top secret, secret, confidential, or higher than top secret, that make this very clear. I would say that Mattis, John Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, should not wait until the bombs are falling before he reveals those truths to Congress and the public. And if he doesn't do it, and he's very unlikely to do it, then his secretary or his aides or assistant secretaries should sacrifice their careers to avert these wars, which must not happen.
That's Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. His latest book is The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Henry Kissinger once called him the most dangerous man in America. That does it for our show. If you'd like to sign up for our daily digest, our news headlines and news alerts each day, you can text the word Democracy Now!, one word, to 66866. Special thanks to our crew here at UC Santa Cruz Learning Technologies, John Radicke, Gary Gyurkos, Juan Perez, Chris Salerno, David Valadez. Also, former Democracy Now! Fellow, now UC Santa Cruz PhD student Juan Carlos Davila, Dennis Moynihan, and Mike Burt. Special thanks to David Shaw and Gene Fox as well. Happy birthday, Samin Fakande. Democracy Now! Is produced by Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Harla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura, Libby Rainey, and Nat Needham. Special thanks to Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Paul Huckabee, Julie Crosby, and Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.